Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and like everyone here, I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual home and to our first public event of this academic year. Today's conversation is presented as part of our Inside the Center series, which highlights the research and writing of our current and recent fellows. Always, our purpose in these talks is to gather attention for some of the provocative work that is happening here at the SHC. Thanks for being with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom where it says CC to start or stop viewing the captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the icon permits you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. Since the fall of 2019, it's hard to believe it's been that long already, when I assumed my current role as director of the center and continuing through the pandemic, one of my priorities was and has been to reinforce our distinctive office at Stanford as a research institute with public-facing programs. The SHC is unusual among university-based humanities centers in that we both house a large number of fellows working on their own projects. This year we have nearly 50 under our roof, and present events like this one that are open to everyone. The work of the fellows is enlivened by the visiting speakers, while the visitors encounter an audience that includes not only Stanford scholars and students, but many others who have met here for the year. At some point, the research conceived or realized here gets published or otherwise made public, and that's what we're celebrating right now, new work by a former fellow. I'm a former fellow myself, and from that perspective, I find it encouraging that we've developed a medium in this series for hearing about people's current projects, which may sometimes start from a seed that was planted 5, 10, or more years ago at the SHC. Inside the Center is one of several series we've launched over the past 3 years, and we intend to keep providing you with events of similar quality and diversity. Now, one more note before I introduce our speaker. I'd like to remind you that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And also, if you'd like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll do our best to get to it following the lecture. Xochitl Marsilli-Vargas, who was a fellow here in the 2020-2021 academic year, is an assistant professor in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Emory University. Her work centers on the reception and circulation of mental health discourses, media technologies, intercultural communication, linguistic analysis, and listening practices. She received her PhD in cultural and linguistic anthropology from just across the bay from here at the University of California, Berkeley. Today, Xochitl will discuss her just published book, Genres of Listening, an Ethnography of Psychoanalysis in Buenos Aires, which is an ethnography of listening practices, proposing that listening can be categorized into genres. Just as there are many ways of speaking, there are many possible ways of listening. And the book traces how psychoanalytic listening circulates beyond the clinical setting to become a central element of social interaction and cultural production in the city, Buenos Aires, that has the largest number of practicing psychologists and psychoanalysts in the world. Xochitl, it's good to see you, even if it's virtual. It's good to see you back in the center, and we're looking forward to hearing about the new book.
Thank you very much, Roland. Thank you so much, everyone at the Humanities Center. I know how much labor is put into this, so thanks, everyone. And I just want to say also that pretty much I finished this book, which just came out 3 weeks ago, so I'm extremely happy to share this with you at the Humanities Center. So it was a really, really productive time, and it also helped me to start my new project that I am now at UCLA continuing. And so for all of you new fellows, you are in for a treat. I mean, this is a really great opportunity, and I'm really happy to share everything with you. So the book that I'm going to be talking about, my book, makes 2 particular big claims. So the first claim that the book makes is that psychoanalytic listening inside and outside the clinic can be understood as a genre of listening. At the most basic level, what I identified as a genre of listening follows a particular structure and it's different from other forms of listening. So for example, the notational listening. The second big claim the book makes is that in the city of Buenos Aires, as Roland said, psychoanalytic listening as a genre has left the clinic and have circulated throughout many different social interactions and media outlets. So in order to condense the work of this book, which took me like 10 years to finish, I mean, the whole process, into 40 minutes, it's a little bit crunch. So I decided to present three main ideas today. So the first part is going to be about listening and why listening is important. The second part will be dedicated to examine psychoanalytic listening as a genre. What is it? And the third one, a lot of examples about how this form of listening circulates outside of the clinical setting. Okay, so with that introduction, let me just begin this presentation. Okay, so part one, listening. Sounds carry information about the world. Every time we listen, communication takes place. These are well-known facts for speech sounds, and it is also true for other types of sounds, such as music or sounds that are produced by nature or machines. In principle, each acoustic event can be perceived as a sign carrier through which information about the world is communicated. When trying to codify a sound, a particular interpretation and context are key to its understanding. When listening to the same sound, different listeners might focus on different information carried by the sound. Conversely, some information can be gathered by only a few listeners. For example, when a mechanic is listening to the sound produced by a car and decoding the sounds in a particular way. Or when listening to a voice through the telephone, a person may be able to detect different moods if she is familiar with the speaker. Consequently, sound as language carries information through a specific context that emerge at the moment of reception. I'd like to exemplify the dialectic meaning context of listening by examining Edgar Allan Poe's famous story, The Murders in the Rue Morgue, where the hero, Auguste Dupin, a French fallen aristocrat with a remarkable capacity of analytic reasoning, solves the brutal murder of two women killed by an orangutan. While the murders were taking place, numerous witnesses, which did not have any visual access to the crime, heard two suspects, one speaking in a gruff tone that everybody agreed it was a Frenchman, and a second one who spoke in a shrill voice that the witnesses could not agree on the language he or she was speaking. The witnesses, the listeners, were from 5 different nationalities: an Italian, an Englishman, a Spaniard, a Dutchman, and a Frenchman. And each attempted to describe the language spoken by the shrill voice as that of a foreigner. Each witness was sure that it was not the voice of one of their own countrymen. Instead, they described the voice as different languages: Spanish, French, German, English, and Russian. This notorious discrepancy on the language that the witnesses heard ultimately led Dupin to conclude that the voice could not be human, and the mystery is done resolved. Poe's stories underline many interesting dimensions about the act of listening. It helps us understand that sounds that do not correspond to the realm of linguistic utterances and that are not musical compositions lack the systematicity that are core to the constitution of any symbolic system. If a hearer cannot recognize the meaning of particular signs, the meaning can be inferred, most likely, by looking at it contextually. This means that unintelligible sounds get their meaning depending on who, where, and when they were produced, facilitating their interpretation. But when there is no systematicity, as in the sounds produced by the shrill voice in Poe's stories, the hearer will invoke a sound that resembles something familiar. And this happens all the time. We don't have ear sleeps like we have when we are seeing things. Well, except for the following example, in which there is definitely an attempt to move away from reasoning while listening. Pierre Schaeffer, the famous French composer and musical engineer, was very much aware that the listener will always invoke a referent when listening to a sound. He became interested in figuring out if there is a possibility of listening without establishing a referent. In 1955, he began experimenting with listening practices that did not involve any other sensorial perception. He then coined the term acousmatic, which defines the experience of a listener that has no visual access to the sound source. Schaffer held that the acousmatic listening experience was one that reduced sound to the field of hearing alone. If you are not looking to the source of sound making, subjects move their attention away from the physical object responsible for auditory perception and toward the content of this perception. Schaffer remarked, quote, often surprised, often uncertain, we discovered that much of what we thought we were hearing was in reality only seen and explained by the context. Thus, the acousmatic exercise, while an artificial experiment, opens the possibility of listening to the quality of sound without reasoning. In Poe's story, we have an example where the source of sound is unseen. The voices were heard and were the only available material to understand what was happening inside the house. Through context, to screaming women in danger, plus two voices discussing, the listeners transformed the unknown into sign, different languages. In contrast with acousmatics, which focuses only on the quality of sound, out of the impossibility of recognition in Poe's example, reasoning was involved. David Tuke, a music composer who has studied music listening practices, explains that, quote, sound must be trusted, cannot be trusted, so it has power. When sound that should be present seems to be absent, this is frightening, end of quote. And I want us here to think, for instance, at the beginning of the pandemic in lockdown, when we came out of our houses, there was an eerie silence, right? I mean, so where sound were supposed to be, it wasn't, and that made the experience a little bit frightening. Poe still shows that we create signs, real or imagined, every time we hear something because listening provides an ordering function. In everyday experience, listeners are always looking for meaning. Sounds are always attached to a sound image, whether we like it or not. There is always a semiotic process whether we are conscious of this or not. There is no sound without meaning, unless artificially experimenting with acousmatic. Another form in which we can find no connection with a sound and its referent are the so-called mondegreens. A mondegreen is the mishearing or misinterpretation of a phrase as a result of a near homophony, in a way that it gives it a new meaning. These misinterpretations are commonly found when listening to the lyrics of music or verbal poetry, although they can occur in any other context. This mimetic term was proposed by Sylvia Wright in 1954. She recalled the deep effect made on her as a child by hearing one particular verse of the ballad, The Earl of Murray. She heard the following at the end of the verse. Ye highlands and ye lowlands, oh, where hae you been? They hae slain the Earl of Murray and the Lady Mondegreen. The actual text reads, ye highlands and ye lowlands, oh, where have you been? They have slain Earl Murray and they've laid him on the green. Mishearings or mondegreens are an interesting phenomena because they stand in direct opposition to verbal confusion or what we usually call slips of the tongue. One could think of slips of the tongue as momentary relaxation of self-monitoring, breaking the circuit of apparently simultaneous self-hearing that allow unconscious impulses to take control. But though mishearings may appear subversively to sabotage sense too, they are in fact transforming random noise into meaning, hence moving from the direction of nonsense to sense. In contrast, slips of the tongue are the disordering of sense by nonsense. Through listening, as we can see, there is a process of ordering, of putting things into place, and this idea is critical for the understanding of listening genres as providing frames of reference. The opposite phenomena, the opposite to mondegreens, happen when meanings, or when we can't see the source of a sound, happen when meanings are already codified by a convention. These acoustic signs, even though the hearer is able to recognize through a conventionalized agreement on a specific meaning, are decoded differently when listened by different hearers. Take, for example, the music or medical realm, in which each sound, for example, a particular musical note or a sound inside the body, is attached to a particular referent that is fixed. In order to understand the sounds, the ear has to be trained in what Michel Chion called semantic listening. Real hearers can understand the nature of the sound, but the meaning is something that only a few master, and in this mastery lies a material reality. Particular sound images, thus, will have different concepts attached to them depending on the individual who listens in a particular way. Listening is something that hearers learn to do, and depending on an array of different factors, there is a variety of pragmatics attached to it. Social actors listen pragmatically as well as intentionally. And as the doctor with the stethoscope and post-tale shows, hearers are listening with a purpose. They are constantly looking for directed meanings, and the outcome of their interpretation transforms various social dimensions. As Stravinsky is attributed to have said, listening is an effort, and in this effort points to the constitution of social positions and identities. Thus, one of the main arguments genres of listening makes is that just as there are many ways of speaking, there are many possible ways of listening. Compassionate listening is not the same as when a mechanic is listening to the sound of a broken car, and listening to an opera is different from a doctor listening to a patient's heart through the stethoscope. A music expert, for instance, may be listening for the musical form of a particular music piece, focusing on structure, style, syntax, and history through either architectonic or synoptic listening, which requires a certain knowledge of musical structure. While a non-musical expert who listens to the same musical piece may experience instead a physical and emotional change, goosebumps, tears, without having any notion of musical structure. Each particular way of listening just mentioned, among many, many more, I contend is a genre of listening. A genre of listening is a framework of relevance that surfaces at the moment of reception and orients the apprehension of sound. Sound reception is not neutral. It always involves a particular type of ideological and practice intervention, and it is never automatic. The listener, by focusing through a particular frame, creates a context, or more precisely, a contextual configuration of reception that provides a unique interpretative lens. Listening genres, as speech genres, are types that are produced at the moment of reception, and they are social in that they present a cultural horizon by helping to elucidate how the listener tunes the ear into a particular frequency, and thus, as much as ways of speaking, create structures of relevance that provide directionality. Genres are useful units of analysis because they link particular formal units, for example, phonetic, lexical, and grammatical, to thematic ones. They also structure relations between the speaker and listeners and other participants during spoken communication. This means that genres pre-exist any particular interaction, and yet they are adopted and combined in speech situations. Generic types thus orient toward a specific conceptual horizon, determined by the concrete situation of the speech communication event, the personal composition of its participants, and the already established orders of knowledge that precedes the interaction. Okay, part 2, psychoanalytic listening as a genre. The idea of genres of listening came out as a result of more than 6 years of fieldwork among psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, psychologists, patients, and analysts. The people who attend psychoanalytic sessions are known, in Buenos Aires, Argentina. What I discover and write extensively in this book is that in Buenos Aires, a particular listening genre, psychoanalytic listening, has left the clinical setting permeating many different social arenas, calling a specific culture of listening. Argentina is an interesting place to study psychoanalysis because it's the country with more psychoanalysts per capita in the world, even more than Paris and New York, and also because its universal healthcare system provides psychoanalysis for free in most public hospitals and clinics. So let's take a look at some numbers here. So this was done in 2019 by the World Health Organization, and basically in this chart, we are seeing how many psychologists/psychoanalysts per 100,000 inhabitants are in each country. And as you can see, Argentina is way above any other country with 222.6 psychologists per 100,000 inhabitants. The second one is Costa Rica, which was a surprise in the past because I have been following this chart for many years. It was Denmark, and Denmark is not even anymore in this particular new chart. Now, this is Argentina. If we actually focus on Buenos Aires, the numbers are really interesting. Look at this chart. So in Buenos Aires, and these are also the top 10 countries, psychologists per 100,000 inhabitants. Buenos Aires, as you can see, explodes. And I just want you to focus on the first two lines. So Buenos Aires, if we do a very normal statistic analysis, and this is done by how many people are practicing, how many people have died, how many people have registered in school, etc., you get almost 1,600,000 psychologists / analysts per 100,000 inhabitants. And if we do a very conservative estimate, and this is an estimate that Modesto Alonso, who is a psychoanalyst himself, psychologist also, and a statistician, said if we incur in an error of 0, so basically if nothing of their statistics methods work, it would still, let's say, it would be cut in half, and that's almost 100 analysts, psychoanalysts, psychologists per 100,000 inhabitants. So in Buenos Aires, there are between 1,400 to 789 psychologists every 100,000 inhabitants, which it's incredibly high. And in 2017, a national survey conducted by TNS, which is a particular channel, found that in Argentina, the country, 32% of the respondents had at some time made a psychological consultation. So we can probably assume that in Buenos Aires, these numbers would at least double, if not triple, I don't know. Okay, so Buenos Aires also is an interesting place because psychoanalysis has left the clinical setting, as I said, and has become not only a form of listening, but a cultural object that circulates. So we have a great example here when I said that actually psychoanalysis surpasses class, gender, even religion, beliefs. We have a great example here with the Pope, which he actually said that he had weekly psychoanalytic sessions when he was 42. Of course, he was not the Pope then, but he was well into a great career, you know, to become the Pope that he is. We also have psychoanalysis in advertisements, which is something really interesting. And I want us to focus on this video, which is very short. So pay attention and maybe we can discuss it in the Q&A.
¿Cómo estás, Julián?
No sé.
La culpa es de tu madre.
Claro.
Nos vemos la próxima semana.
Dale. Extremadamente práctico. 1882, sabor Fernet y cola. Listo para tomar.
There is also psychoanalysis in a lot of social media, and I like this page because it's called Las Nenas de Lacan, which translates like Lacan's girls, in which young women, you know, confess their love for Lacan. There is also a lot of comic books and graphic artists who depict the analytic encounter. We have here Sandra, and it reads, the patient says to the psychoanalyst, "Doctor, women scare me." The analyst, "Well, let's look at your childhood." The patient says, "What if my mother finds out?" Again, another ideologist of gender. And this is another example of my favorite, actually, artist, which his name is Tute, and we can see here an image of the analytic encounter. Okay, to begin understanding psychoanalytic listening as a genre and its performative reach and how listening creates social identities, let's take a look at the following example recorded inside the public mental health hospital, Braulio Moyano. Alicia, a young psychoanalyst who has been working at the drug and alcohol division of this mental health ward for the past 10 years, and that also has an individual private practice, explained to me that inside the public hospital, she provides psychoanalytic sessions in an office where there is no couch, No payment is involved, and where staff members and doctors come and go in the office while sessions are being performed, an absolute opposite to orthodox psychoanalytic practices. When I asked her if what she was performing at the public hospital was psychoanalysis, she answered the following. Well, it depends on how you define psychoanalysis. For me, I don't need to have a couch, a quiet space, and a picture of Freud on one of the walls to do psychoanalysis. When I'm talking with my patients, I listen as a psychoanalyst, and that's how I think psychoanalysis is done inside public hospitals. It is far from being an orthodox kind of psychoanalysis, which would be closer to what I do at home. But what really defines psychoanalysis for me is the analytic listening. And I become a psychoanalyst every time I'm listening to people that way. Eduardo Mandelbaum, another psychoanalyst, which is a very senior analyst with more than 50 years of clinical practice, told me something similar. He said, being trained as an analyst and having worked for so many years in my personal practice, it is hard to turn off the psychoanalytic ear. Everywhere you go, you start to analyze what people are saying. It's like a curse. What Mandelbaum is telling us is that as an analyst with many, many years of experience listening to different analyzers, he developed a psychoanalytic ear, one that refuses to be contained within the space of the clinic. Once defined as the talking cure, psychoanalysis emphasis has mostly been on language. When an analyzer is able to articulate into words the unconscious, maybe repressed drives that guide our behavior, the analyzer can liberate his or herself of disturbances such as neuroses, anxieties, and hysteric episodes. But as Alicia and Mandelbaum's quotes suggest, another way of understanding psychoanalysis is by listening in a particular way. What they are telling us is that anywhere, at any place, one can become an analyst by listening with a psychoanalytic ear. And also that through the act of listening, there is a process of transformation that allows for the creation of particular subjectivities. That is, it is performative. But what exactly is this psychoanalytic genre? Let me explain a little bit more what this form of listening looks like. For both Freud and his disciple, this is what it means. While analyzing the sense of guilt in the ego and the id, Freud explains the emergence of a particular kind of listening that gets constituted during childhood through the superego, which involves the internalization of parental voices. These internalizations create oral residues that the child is not yet capable of understanding, decoding as such. But the unconscious process of internalizing these auditory signs will eventually constitute the superego, which is usually punitive and regulatory in essence. Expanding this idea further in the article on the exceptional position of the auditory sphere, Otto Eisenhower, a Viennese analyst, intended to explain how this process happens physically as well as psychically. Eisenhower proposed a curious comparison between the constitution of the superego and the crustacean palemon, which is this guy here that you are seeing, which is a kind of prawn. The crustacean has an otolith apparatus, which is a structure in the inner ear responsible for balance, movement, sense of gravity, and sound detection. Interestingly, in the crustacean, this apparatus does not serve the function of hearing, but serves the purpose of the perception of movement and position of the body relative to its environment and orientation in space. In order to be able to orient itself, the crustacean fills the canal of the otolith apparatus with sand or any material that is close by. In other words, the crustacean incorporates external elements in its organ to be able to orient itself, and the characteristics of the element it incorporates, rocks, sand, magnetic debris, etc., will determine its awareness and the way it perceives the environment. For Eisenhower, something similar happens with the formation of the unconscious. The external resonance of the outer wall, which is yet to be decoded by the infant, gets inside the auditory sphere the same way the crustacean fills its ear with gravel, making it an unconscious imprint in the infant's behavior. The superego thus gets constituted as the psychical organ of equilibrium, the one who regulates and controls behavior. And it is in the capacity of ordering linguistically the structure of the auditory perception that the child begins to form an inner voice. And for Eisenhower, this is what constitutes the ego apparatus in mankind. The idea that Freud postulated and later developed by Eisenhower, the resonance that make an imprint in the infant psyche, is later amplified and circulated by Jacques Lacan. It is known that central to Lacan's theory of language is the work of Fernandin de Saussure, especially Saussure's observation that the linguistic system is constituted by signifiers which stand in relation to something which is signified, this relationship being arbitrarily assigned by a particular code. Lacan developed his own conceptualization by regarding that something which is signified is itself another signifier. He tells us that signifiers can be related to each other in a particular linguistic space and manifold sequences in what he called a signifying chain in accord with semantic and syntactic laws of conventions. For Lacan, in the course of speech, particular words then will become nodes for a particular salient and polyphonic chain of signifiers. Thereby, the primary task of the analyst is the, quote, achievement of a state of resonance. The concept of resonance developed between Freud and his disciples remained the core of psychoanalytic listening. It implicates a codification that does not necessarily involve an act of consciousness, yet it needs to reach consciousness for interpretation through the resonance of the analysans and analyst listening. The imprints that are formed in the psyche of the infant throughout her life are thus what will inform the formation of the analysand's subjectivity. They will form, as Lacan points out, nodes with this enunciation of particular words that the analyst will be able to uncover once she resonates with the analysand's subjectivity. So let's try to illustrate this with some of my data. I want to present Juan's example taken at the Argentine Psychoanalytic Association inside a very sui generis form of psychoanalysis called multifamily psychoanalytic structural sessions. This is a space where up to 80 analysans and between 15 to 20 analysts are present. Some people come by themselves and others with relatives. And I want to focus on the example of a particular person, Juan. So Juan has been coming to these sessions for a year, but he never intervened. So basically, just as context, these large gatherings, people will raise their hand and they will tell whatever it is that they feel compelled to share. There will be silence, then another people will do the same. And at the end, the resonance, they claim, of all of the words that created this imprint in the psyche of the participants will come out with a word like sadness, anxiety, separation, as the words that resonate in most of them. So in this particular occasion, Juan raised his hand. So Juan has been coming to the sessions for a year, but never intervened. But on this occasion, finally, he decided to speak after the comments made by Adela, a constant attendee who, contrary to the other speakers, she talks and talks and talks, and she kind of goes into these forever rants, which are usually antagonistic. Here is what Juan said. My name is Juan, and I have been coming to the meetings for more or less a year, and I haven't ever talked before. It is sad to listen to the lady's story. She obviously wants to tell us something. If we could only listen to what she wants to say, what she means, but the lady keeps repeating the same story without producing any effect. After Juan's comment, a senior analyst responded the following. Juan, first, I am surprised that you said Adela always repeats the same story without producing any effect. She got you talking today for the first time. Great, something happened so that her insistent discourse finally found an answer because you thought I have to say something. So she's not so wrong in insisting to be listened to because in the end, someone will listen to her. After having attended the multifamily psychoanalytic sessions for a year, Juan finally felt compelled to speak, moved by the fact that, as he said, he wanted to understand the unconscious, maybe real, meaning behind Adela's story. As we can see in this example, Juan was not aiming to have what Adela was saying clarified or conceptualized, represented or reformulated in the analyzer's own words, but rather to listen, to resonate with the inaudible voices of Adela's words. Listening in this context is a bodily experience rather than a mere reception of sound. By focusing on the spoken intentions of Adela's story, Juan was already listening in a particular way. He was looking for meanings that had not been uttered, that was not to be found somewhat outside of that was to be found somehow outside of the unconscious realm of utterances. He was enacting psychoanalytic listening as a genre. He was listening as not something one passively submits to, but as a particular kind of action itself. Through this and many more examples, I found that there is always a particular temporality attached to this listening genre. The amount of time required to listen and to be able to make sense of it varies from case to case, as is, for example, anthropological listening. That is, psychoanalytic listening is cumulative. Another characteristic the multifamily sessions taught me is that this listening genre, as many, many others, again, anthropological listening, is learned, as exemplified in Roberto's participation, an avid multifamily attendee in his late 60s who had been coming to the sessions for 10 years when I met him in 2015. He made the following intervention after a discussion about misunderstanding with families. He explained that he used to always get involved and give unsolicited opinions every time his daughter had a conversation with her mother until something happened. And this is Roberto's talking. There was a moment in which I could listen, and I could see that I was wrong, and that I had been wrong for a long time. I was wrong because the truth is that I could not listen. And here, the multifamily structured psychoanalytic therapy was taught how to listen. Because when one is taken by a sentiment, one cannot think straight or listen. And that is a phrase that one has to take home. Roberto's example describes the cultivation of psychoanalytic listening as a moment of revelation. There was an instant where he was suddenly able to listen. So we go back to the temporality of this particular listening, which is cumulative. And through this required competence, he was able to understand his past mistakes and make amends. This learning process follows a personal trajectory, and it is something that cannot be measured. But he did not listen denotationally, that's for sure. Another thing I discovered that makes up the genre of listening, psychoanalytic listening, is prosodic enunciation, or what I call the music in the words, or how words sound and resound beyond their denotational meaning. As a prominent female analyst told me, quote, "When talking to our patients or analyzers, what is more important to us is not what they say, but how they say it." In the agency of the letter, Lacan makes reference to scansion, a method or practice of determining and graphically representing the metrical patterns of a line in a poem. It relies on the existence of meter, whose structure it brings to light through the action of scanning. Scanning brings to light a hidden rhythm, allowing one to hear a tempo, at first indiscernible, but working silently without saying its name. For analyst and literary scholar Isabella Alfandri, scanning enables the turning into the text of the unconscious. The music in the words is thus what enables a psychoanalytic performance where listening to the steps of the music in the speech of the analyzer is key to bring it to light, what I call the psychic doppelganger. Okay, we reached last part. Part 3, psychoanalysis outside of the clinic. Psychoanalytic listening has permeated different spheres. So this form of listening that I've been explaining so far, I claim, has somehow left the clinical setting and became a social way of listening in Buenos Aires. A form of listening that permeates different spheres of social interaction, surpassing the clinical setting and becoming a social way of listening. This means that during casual interactions, Porteños, as the inhabitants of Buenos Aires are called, suspend the denotation context of verbal utterances, listening to that is not said. It underlines not only the generic capacity of this specific form of listening, but also points to the emergence of particular ideologies reflected in the common adversivity form, what you really mean is. Frequently voiced after an utterance has been made, again, during casual conversations. So the lay listener, like the analyst, is always listening for signs that can lead to a possible diagnosis or interpretation. Consider the following example that took place inside a cab. A woman in her early 30s and a taxi driver, a man in his 50s, both born and raised in Buenos Aires, drove in front of a group of children dressed in white and light blue. The woman looked at the children and the following exchange ensued. Woman: I really dislike that combination of color, especially light blue. I don't think anybody looks good in that color. Taxi driver: what's the matter? I listen to a lot of bad vibe in your words. Does your mother wear that color often? Woman: what are you talking about? Taxi driver: I think that you mean something else. What you really mean is, right? But you are not able to make sense of it. No one hates a color without a reason. The woman responded, no, not my mother. But now that you mention it, I will have to think about it. The exchange presented is extraordinarily common in Buenos Aires when posing questions about what are the credentials that a subject possesses when making apparently unrelated connections between the semantic meaning or a particular utterance and a psychoanalytical interpretation. You don't like a color, therefore you're thinking of a particular person you dislike. I came out with this following formula. When you say X, I hear Y. There is usually, when you ask them how did they come out with these interpretations, they will say, they will make reference to the personal years that they have gone through therapy, some answers with the commonsensical relationship between an author and its real meanings, like it's obvious, without further explanation, and some reveal that a close friend or family member is a therapist, and consequently, they are exposed to the particularities of this genre of listening. Here's another example of a very different form of psychoanalytic listening as genre, but follows the same structure. So let's look at Ramiro's predicament. So I was with Ramiro, a really good friend, and we were just talking. We were in Buenos Aires. He lives in the United States. And then he told me this story. Last summer in Buenos Aires, I was coming back from having dinner with my brother, and the taxi driver kept trying to make small talk. At one point, he asked me if I had kids. I said, yes, Leo and Fede. He then asked me how old they were. I told him Leo is 11 and Fede is 15. At that point, we were on a stoplight, and the taxi driver, a man in his 50s, turned to the back seat where I was sitting and asked me while looking me in the eye, why did you mention the name of your youngest son first? It was such a strange question, so I mumbled, I don't know, because 11 goes before 15, to which he responded, yes, but Fede was born before Leo, right? Ramiro told me that the exchange left him feeling uneasy and sad. He kept wondering whether he actually had a favorite song, the question he had heard when the taxi driver asked why he mentioned Leo's name before Fede's. After a long pause, he laughed and said, I don't know why I listened to the taxi driver, but the question still makes rounds in my head. In both examples, the two taxi driver examples, the participants in the conversations listened to something beyond the notation. In the second example, so in Ramiro's example, the taxi driver never asked Ramiro whether he had a favorite song. What were the taxi driver and Ramiro listening to in each other's statements? Clearly, both heard something beyond the mere denotation of their words, prompting the taxi driver to ask why Ramiro chose that particular order when mentioning his son's name, and in turn compelling Ramiro to hear that he was being accused of having a favorite song. The most distinct practice in which we can understand auditory ideologies in the act of listening, as the first example of the taxi driver shows, is by a very particular form of reported speech, where what is being reported is not a direct or indirect form of quotation, but instead a new narrative centered on unconscious practices. Reported speech in any of its forms is very useful for the examination of how alterity is being brought into light and to the analysis of listening genres because it points to how the listener are listening to each other words. When we use indirect discourse, we do not just apply a grammatical rule. Instead, we need to analyze and respond to the reported utterance and show a dialogical relationship to it. And listening is key to this process. So when people in Buenos Aires use the addressivity form, what you really mean is they are reporting the speech of the other person's utterance. But what kind of report is happening? The type token relationship in this form of quotation becomes complex because many different tokens of the same type can emerge. For example, when more than one listener interprets different meanings out of the same statement. The problem of the appropriation of one speaker's discourse by another, who may employ it in a manner either directly or obliquely opposed to the original intention, is fundamental in psychoanalytic listening. It points to the uniqueness and non-transferable quality of an individual. And this is a very modern ideology, which is another claim of the book that I didn't have time to cover here, which is that by listening within psychoanalytic ear, they are also performing modernity. Psychoanalytic listening, both inside and outside of the clinic, is heteroglossic because it is constituted by multiple voices. But these voices are structured differently than how the voices in ordinary speech are structured. The voices in ordinary speech are organized this way. I, the current self, others can be quoted but normally signaled as such, and the psychic doppelganger held in abeyance. In psychoanalytic listening, they are reorganized like this. I, doppelganger, others get voice unconsciously, self, all of the above. In non-psychoanalytic listening, thus, ordinary speech, the hearer takes the I as the sole producer of the utterance. But in the formula, when you say X, I hear Y, the I who produced the utterance is relegated, and the listener directs their full focus to the psychic doppelganger. If a listener uses this new hierarchization of the utterance between I, doppelganger, other self, to understand a person's words, I claim the listener is employing the genre of psychoanalytic listening. The addressivity form, what you really mean, thus plays the role of a shifter, which is a term whose meaning cannot be determined without referring to the message that's being communicated between a sender and a receiver. For example, the words I, you, here, now, etc., that can only be understood in the context that they have been uttered, making explicit how the listener is listening. Through Buenos Aires, then, after doing a lot of fieldwork, I discovered that personal identities, conception of citizenships, and the construction of the political are consistently rooted not only in the performativity associated with speaking, but also, and crucially, in this particular form of listening based on psychoanalysis. As discussed in this book, in Buenos Aires, such listening is social, produced by a collectivity of individuals and performed in all sorts of interpretation, surpassing, as I mentioned, class, age, and gender classifications. In this way, the genre of psychoanalytic listening has become what Marcel Mauss called a social fact, which he defines as an activity that has consequences throughout society in the economic, legal, political, and religious spheres. We already saw, for instance, how the Pope was psychoanalyzed. Throughout this book, the reader will find many examples of the dissemination of the psychoanalytic listening genre in the wild, like the examples of the taxi drivers presented. And although please note that this is true, I do not claim that these generic forms of listening are indeed a performance of psychoanalysis. They show that in Buenos Aires, in many occasions, people listen to the words as an embodied practice rather than focusing only on the denotation. They focus on how words sound, on what they invoke in them. This book demonstrates that listening genres and listening creates and sustains social relations. It also suggests that social relations produce a form of listening that defies the here and now of sound production, and it lingers. It is cultivated, and it's a process that is embodied through the concept of resonance. As musician and cultural theorist Scott Wilson notes, quote, one could say that one only hears what one already knows. one always hears an echo, but at the same time, the music that animates and disturbs us always hints to something else, something strange and unknown, end of quote. Sound are impregnated with semiotic meaning and content. We assign to them meanings, and these meanings are the product of the social relation of the active body encountering and structuring the world. This book is a window to a world traversed by listening, to that which is not said, but is still known. Bottom line, everything that subject listens matter. Listening to music, to the sounds produced by the body, or murderous gorillas. By focusing on the constitution of genres of listening, in my book, I argue that there is possible to establish a listening orientation that is important for the conceptualization of new ways of knowing and gaining a deeper understanding of how the members of a society relate to each other when the analysis of talk is insufficient. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Xochitl. We're going to have a number of questions from our audience. We have an audience of about 80 people right now, and they are from around the country, as well as from Mexico, from India, the Philippines, Nigeria, and of course, Argentina, and a lot more. So I will do my best to get to as many questions as I can, but let me just urge the audience, if you would like to submit a question and you haven't done so yet, please feel free to do so through the Q&A function on Zoom. Xochitl, I have so many questions I want to ask you myself, but let me start with one that you alluded to, something you alluded to near the end of the talk, which was that something that got crowded out of this particular presentation was the part of the argument that says that the kind of listening you're describing is characteristic of modernity. What is, fill us in on that part of the argument. What is somehow modern about this particular kind of psychoanalytically derived listening?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Roland. Yes, so this is something that I actually explore in chapter 5 of my book in detail. And this is the idea. So there are a lot of semiotic ideologies that construct subjectivity in many different ways. And there is one specifically that actually points to the emergence of the new liberal subject, which is a very, very modern subject in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as a contained self. Basically, that it points to the uniqueness of each individual. So when you become an irreplaceable person, and that's when the proliferation of biographies, right, and the idea of a person who is bounded, who is not equal to another, which is contained. So Chakrabarty actually talks about how psychoanalysis is the epitome of the modern self, because psychoanalysis, it's about your own self, your own experiences, your own contained self. Now we are seeing something, and in Buenos Aires, so the point that I'm trying to make is that by listening psychoanalytic, right, by focusing on the specificities of the individual, there is some kind of a performative of the modern subject. Now that has been challenged right now, I think, with because now there seems to be a new paradigm in late liberalism, which is that you have the contained subject, but also it should be permeable. So we see that, for instance, with a lot of different, yoga and, attention of the self, in which let yourself feel, let yourself be with others, connect with others, but not too much. So there's this paradox between the contained and the permeable subject. So that's the main point that I'm trying to make when I said that it's a performance of modernity, that what it's pointing to is this very particular semiotic ideology that the subject is unique and irreplaceable and contained.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. That's a good to have have you be able to expand a little bit on that point for us. Here's a question that I think is going to occur to a lot of people who come from the discipline of literature, which is, and I would frame it this way. So you're an anthropologist and you work in a department of Spanish and Portuguese. The central term really of the project is genre. How did that term get into the project? How did you choose it as opposed to, say, You might have chosen the sociological term habitus or some other sort of term that would have done similar work for the project. How did it come to be, and why does it work for this project?
Well, thanks, Roland. Again, a very important question and a very contested question, actually, because when I was putting together these ideas, one of my advisors actually was very much against the idea of using genres. Why? Because intertextuality, of course. I mean, like intertextuality shows us that there are no such things as genres, right? That everything is somehow connected. And although there are some genres, everything kind of becomes this almost like an octopus with different extremities. So he was not necessarily happy with it, but my other advisor was, yes, do it. And so why? I mean, and why do I decided to go with genres and not habitus? First of all, habitus, which I thought about a lot. I think that people sometimes use habitus in a way that they forgot that it always implies a field. And that field is a contentious relationship with the habitus. And that's not happening in Argentina. That's not happening with psychoanalytic listening. So there is not a contentious relation. And we can talk about this because some people tell me about what are the ethical connotations about what you really mean is that somebody is actually, telling you more, knowing more about your intimate self than yourself. But in my experience in Buenos Aires, the interpolation almost 100% of the world's work, and people find value on the interpretations of other people's statements. So I didn't want to use habitus because I didn't see it as a contentious relationship with the field. But it is cultivated in that way. Maybe we can talk a little bit about habitus. And genre, why genre? Okay, so yes, let me just admit that by using the word genre, I am placing artificial, and they are artificial boundaries to social phenomena. But I do think that, I'm a linguistic anthropologist by training, and we focus always on the productive side of language, right, of speech, of utterances. But the receptive side had been very seldom studied, at least in my field. There are a lot of people who have worked on listening. So if you want artificially, separating forms of listening that I contend, you can actually see a structure on them, that they're not different. So when you talk to your grandma, it's not the same, when you listen to your grandma, it's not the same as when you're listening to your professor or when you're listening in other forms. And of course, the performativity of it, it's really important. So by doing it artificially, I think that it can help us understand ways of how social relations are formed beyond the textual paradigm. And yes, genre can be artificial, but I think it's useful just as a beginning. We need to do a lot more, but as a beginning to say, like, this is different from this. And genres, as you know, presuppose the social action, and at the same time constructs the social action. I'm talking when speaking, right? So therefore there is a context already in place. And as you saw in the advertisements and all of these different forms in which psychoanalysis circulates, there is already a horizon of expectation, if we want to use that particular phrase. And when we listen, right, it's like a co-occurrence of those two different factors. I can talk forever, but I'm just going to stop here.
Okay, two questions about genre that pick up from that point from the audience. Here's the first one. I'll paraphrase the question. I'm curious about instances of predisposition to listen to a thing in a particular way of which the listener herself may not be conscious. In your definition, you stress that genres of listening are ideological, never automatic. Do you deal then with tendencies of listening within a genre of listening in which the listener may not be aware that it is taking place?
Well, yes, of course, actually. And I'm really sorry if this came out as not clear. I actually think that most of these genres, they're unconscious, right? We reproduce them because we're part of a particular listening community. But of course, they are ideological in some ways. When we are listening to I don't know, particular news or particular, I mean, so listening is ideological every time, for sure also, right? Because we are social beings. And I am, you know, I am a daughter of the School of Frankfurt, and I do believe that we are already embedded into these structures and that somehow we are reproducing some of them, not all of them all the time, unconsciously. So I feel that genres are both unconscious always, because we are not aware, as when we speak, we are not aware of, we're not being self-reflexive about all the genres that we're employed. I mean, in some cases we are, like when you're giving a talk and then you have to start with a very particular generic form of speech. But in most casual conversations, we're not, although we're always speaking in genres. And we're also listening always in genres, but some of them are more ideological than others. And of course, when you want to be mad, right? For instance, when, you know, with all of these debates about safe space, etc. I mean, there's sometimes you tell students like, let's talk about this. And they're like, no, there's no point to talk about them. So they already want to stay mad, I would say, in certain cases. So there is a particular way of listening that is already reflexively ideological. I don't know if I answered the question, but
yeah, I think so. I mean, I always think of genre as sort of amphibious in terms of intention. That is, there's a lot of ways that we may think we're changing a genre or driving it ourselves, but very often it is driving us in ways that we're not even aware of. And I think both sides of that have to probably be accounted for in this, which it sounds like this is what the questioner is asking you to think about. Another question from the audience about genre. And this one is about training. To paraphrase, how does one learn different genres of listening? I'm thinking here of a lot of people I know who became analysts through developing an interest in the practice as patients themselves. What are the forms through which one learns genres of listening? Imitating, training, performing a particular role that maps onto a profession? How formal and informal are the ways that one learns?
Well, that's a great question. And I mean, I don't know the answer exactly, but let me tell you what I know about psychoanalytic listening. And again, I always wanted to compare it to anthropological listening, just because I think they are very similar. First of all, in the case of psychoanalytic listening, and again, anthropological listening, you can't really teach them. And that's why you have to go to analysis, right? Because the idea is that it's an embodied experience, right? So it's not like, oh, I'm going to learn the structure of this particular text, so therefore I can understand, you know, the syntax, blah, 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 the genre. In these particular forms of listening, it is by the concept of resonance, again, which is a concept that I really want to underline, in which it's an embodied experience. And if you want to be an analyst, you must, I mean, this is a must, have to go to analysis. And that's the way you learn. That's the way you learn, by listening to yourself, and by lingering. Let me give you an example of how I came out with this topic. So maybe this will resonate with the question. So when I came back from the field of Argentina, I didn't know what I was going to do. I mean, my only interest when I went to the field was, I'm interested in why psychoanalysis is so prevalent in Buenos Aires, right? That was my question. And then I came back. I have attended the multifamily sessions. I went myself to psychoanalysis as a participant observation, although I got sold on it. And then, you know, all of my life there. So I was there for 2 years. I came back and I still didn't have a question. And it was terrifying experience. And one of my advisors told me, like, listen to your data when you're running, when you're doing everything, and let the data speak to you. Those were his words. And I'm just like, okay. And at one point, literally, I was washing dishes, listening with my iPod. And then at one point, yeah, I mean, that tells you how old I am. At that point, there was this moment of like, duh, you know, it's about listening. So I claim that there was a cumulative listening as, you know, psychoanalytic listening. So basically all the years that I was there and listening, and at one point, everything materialized in this idea. So in that sense, again, that's why I think that psychoanalytic listening and anthropological listening are similar, in that it is the accumulation of oral residues that you are not necessarily conscious. And at one point, you hear, but again, it's not necessarily about, in this particular example, yes, there is referential meaning in the sense that I was like, oh, listening is the key. But in psychoanalysis, it's just, you feel better, right? Or there is something that you understand, like the example of Roberto, right? I was able to listen. He doesn't tell us exactly about what, but it was presumably something that accumulated. And at one point it was like, oh, so this is the way. I don't know if that helped.
Yeah,
but yes,
right.
you can train it also. Yeah, I mean, a music expert, you have to train it. A doctor needs to train to listen to my heart, mechanic. So there's also that more
Formal.
technical.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a couple of questions about gender, and I'm going to try to synthesize them into one. One audience member asks, in the television advertisement, the comic strip, and the taxi cab exchange that you showed, the mother emerged as a centrally problematic figure. In what ways did you observe gender relations being instituted through discourse and psychoanalytic listening? And then another question, or similar question, could you revisit the topic of gender ideologies and say something more about how those ideologies structure psychoanalytic reasoning and listening in your project?
Well, thanks so much for that question. Yes, I mean, I didn't have time to talk much about that. But yeah, in chapter 5, I actually work about psychoanalysis in the media. And one of the main things that kept popping up was the concept of mother. So I'm not really a gender scholar, and I don't know much about gender theory, to be honest, but this was obviously there and I needed to explore it. And what I found is it's really interesting that in Buenos Aires, there are two ways in which mother somehow, when we listen to that word, there are two ideas that comes. One is that she's the source of all your problems, and B, the Oedipus complex. So those two different images are always, somehow they appear when those words, when the word mother comes out. And this is very, very interesting to me, at least, because not being embedded in psychoanalysis, for me, my mother was my mother, but and it is very unfair because the father is also, right, presumably as responsible as the mother, and maybe extended family too, of your psyche and how you function as a normal or not human being, but it's always the mother's fault. And some feminist theories that I was revising were discussing precisely how the mother is supposed to produce the neoliberal subject, which is a productive, good, I guess, contained subject, and that if she fails, then, I mean, if the person fails, it's the mother's fault. So that this link is always there. And so, yes, so the figure of the mother in Buenos Aires, it's incredibly interesting. And the other one that I said is the Oedipus complex. That was another, I mean, I have many examples in the book in which friends, male friends, were talking about different moments, different situations. And every time they talk about an older woman, immediately they would be like, oh, there goes the complex. And I was just, what complex? And the complex was the Oedipus complex. Yeah, it's in their mind that if you like someone who is older, then you have this kind of weird relationship in which you really are in love with your mother. And just to close this, it's really interesting because there are some anthropologists who are doing this work with Trump's speech, because some of it somehow it actually seems like non-coherent. Mm-hmm. But what they are claiming is that they are speaking to their constituencies. It's just that we're not part of that listening community. So I would claim that maybe something similar happens with the concept of mother, that when we listen to it in Buenos Aires, there is this resonance or this extra meaning that is cultural, that if you're not part of that, it doesn't necessarily resonate the same way. So that's what I have to say about it. And just to close also, so there is a very great book, my favorite book in life, Wisdom Sits in Places, by Kit Basso. And he talks precisely about how we speak sin names. So every time we speak, there is meta language, meaning that every time we speak to our communities, our words, like in this particular case, mother, or in Trump's whatever crazy speech, we're listening based on how those names refer to these bigger stories. And in the case of, again, the mother, are these two different figures.
Thank you. Okay, as I often have to do in these events, I'm going to have to apologize in advance to the audience because we have so many great questions. I can't get to them all, but let me try to work in as many as I can in the 15 minutes or so that we have left. Here's one, and I'll paraphrase again. I'm wondering about the implications of this work for broader fields of language studies, many of which are fixated on linguistic production, specifically speaking, and reference and predication in particular. What does your work mean for the empirical status of the linguistic sign and broader semiotic practices? Should we be developing listening counterparts to syntax, semantics, phonology, morphology? Does listening constitute the sign in ways that are perhaps more challenging for sociolinguistics than we've previously understood?
Great question.
Yeah,
And
great
yes,
question.
yes, the answer is, well, I guess the answer as always, it's more complicated. So here I just want to say that I'm part of a group. We are, I think, like 7 people that meet every month. And we're precisely a group of people interested in language who are interested in living the textual side of language and focusing on precisely these embodied forms of communication. In my particular case, the concept of resonance, which is what I'm bringing to the table. So how can we communicate beyond the textual? And in this case, I want to also talk about Michel Serres, yes, sorry, because he talks about the linguicentric and the empire of the language, right? And how to move away from that. And I think there are many of us who are precisely trying to see language as way more than the textual. And I think that, in writing culture, just talking for the anthros here, they tried, James Clifford, they tried to precisely make the textual visible, right? And say like, hey, this is problematic. Actually, we are something that for us, obviously, it's obvious now, but they were like, hey, the textual is a construction, etc., is edited, blah, blah, blah. And I think that some of us are trying to do that with listening. And there is Listening Cultures, which is a book that came out in 2008. And in that volume, people are precisely, and one of the big names is Steve Fell, which he had coined the term acoustemology. So instead of epistemology, right? Thinking about acoustemology. So a way of understanding the world through the acoustic world. And he does field work with different indigenous communities in which they listen, and that's how they understand the world rather than through verbal performance. So that's one answer to that question. The other answer about should we be trying to replicate kind of what the sociolinguistics, linguistic anthropology have done with language, with listening. And that's kind of like what bringing the concept of genre is trying to do in a way, as I said, systematizing something that it's very difficult to do, because when we're dealing with reception, we're obviously dealing with something that you can record speech, but how do I know how you listen, right? So it's fair to say that all of the examples that I brought are through the dialogical exchanges between people. And that's how I am understanding, I'm showing this genre of listening because there's no other way. I guess you have the embodied practices of listening, like ethical listening, or when bells, separate labor versus leisure, etc. But I think, yes, that we should try. It's not necessarily what I'm really interested in. I'm more interested, again, in resonance and going beyond the textual. But I do think that a good exercise, and that's why genre is so important for me in this book, is I believe that there are structures, that not everything is, and that's, my advisor said that I was secretly a structuralist at heart. And maybe not secretly. I do believe that there are structures and that things are not all weird. Yes, they are, but there's also patterns, and it's interesting to focus on that.
Thank you for that, especially the first part of that answer, because I would have imagined that you were, implicated in an emerging cohort of people working on these kinds of questions, but it was useful to hear it framed that way, the way you did a moment ago. Here's a different question. I'll quote it. I'm quite struck by the ways that the non-referential orientation to language, analyzing meaning beyond words, positions Argentinians as great linguistic anthropologists. How should we be thinking about Buenos Aires as a very particular post-colonial situation in which modernist genres of listening become inflected by specific historical, political, and economic dynamics in this context?
Wow, that's a very, very loaded question. Let me just say that I don't engage with coloniality or post-coloniality, but we can talk a little bit. I mean, but the non-referential, right? I mean, how are they linguistic anthropologists? I mean, I think that they have a very, what I hope I demonstrate in the book is that why listening is important, right? I mean,
Right.
why focusing on listening? And I think that if we actually focus on listening, like in this particular example, we can see how there is a community of listeners very different from Mexico, for instance, where I'm from, in which talking about oneself or one problems, it's completely taboo. And if you go to the analyst, you don't talk about it because there's a lot of stigma. In Argentina, if you don't go to the analyst, if you don't go to talk about yourself, you are seen as, it's like equivalent of non-exercising and eating bad food. So it's part of definitely of the doxa. And so yes, they are very aware of this linguistic, that words, I mean, I guess they have internalized that words are polyphonic and that words resonate and that you might be saying something and meaning something else. And that's something that, again, when I first came back from the field to the United States, and again, I was figuring out what I was going to do, I talked to one of my advisors, a white male professor, and when I explained to him this, what you really mean situations, he got so upset. He was like, what? I mean, like, that's intrusive. That is power. I mean, what are these people doing? And I was just like, whoa, I mean, why do you get so upset about this? So that's when I was like, okay, let me explore this more because this seems very interesting. For me, it was just more like funny, like
Yeah.
a horoscope reading almost. And I always inquire more. So there's definitely, again, going back to the concept of modernity. I mean, I think that in the United States, I mean, subjectivity is very bounded. And this idea that the self is contained, it's not at all shared in Buenos Aires. And in Buenos Aires, like people that you don't know will immediately talk to you about, you look like crap. Can you tell me what's going on? And you're like, I don't know you. And then you start these conversations and they're just fascinating. So I think that in Buenos Aires, there is a sociability that actually breaks down this idea of the contained subject, and they understand the psyche. And this is, let me quote Freud when he said that the psyche is extended and it doesn't know of its ending. And I think that in Buenos Aires, there is definitely a performance of that in which people feel that it's on, I mean, that they can, that they all share this kind of, I wouldn't say psyche, but interest in each other's life. They're connected somehow. And maybe this is a good time to talk about why, I mean, and I'm surprised nobody have asked, like, I mean, where is power? And in my book, it's absent. I very purposely took away any power kind of relation dynamic there, because of course power is everywhere and we can talk about it. But in this particular case, I really think that what is happening is it's exchange rather than an imposition. It's symbolic exchange. And that's why I brought Marcel Mauss to the front, because instead of thinking these interpretations as Foucauldian impositions, right? I mean, of like, oh, there's a power inequality. I see them as very productive and actually as, as an act of generosity, if anything, rather than just messing into somebody's life. But I know I went into a tangent and maybe I didn't respond to the question. Sorry.
All right, here's a very different kind of question. During the COVID lockdown, I imagine, says the questioner, that many patients met with their psychoanalyst via Zoom. Do you think a Zoom psychoanalytic session would be different in terms of the idea of resonance? That is to say, how does technological mediation affect the experience of resonance?
That's a great question, and I'm actually writing a piece on that. So I have stuff to say about it. Well, first of all, yeah, I mean, I think you can still do it. So a lot of my friends in Buenos Aires, when lockdown happened, they actually got their laptops, put them in their bags of their whatever, like in a chair or something, and then lay down in a couch. So in order to replicate the actual analyst relationship, let's remember that when you're in actual analysis, you're not face-to-face, you are actually on a couch. So the presence of the person might or might not be important, right? For resonance or for this, you know, like the unconscious to flourish. So I think, I mean, there was a lot, I mean, when I first came to Buenos Aires the first time in 2012, and I talk about Zoom, well, there was Skype at that point. I would say 99% of the analysts were like, no, that's ridiculous, that doesn't work, that's bad, they're unconscious, you need transference, blah, blah, blah. But now everybody loves it. I mean, so it's, but I do think that going back, I mean, beyond that, that you don't need co-presence. I think that resonance is, it's about voice, right? It's about, I mean, so if we think about, I mean, what differs these pedestrian forms of psychoanalysis, or, you know, this, what you really mean is like caricatures of this encounter, is transference. There's no transference going there. And I think that transference is the transferential relationship. It's what distinguishes the analytic encounter than any other form of exchange or talking with your friends. And that you don't need co-presence for that. So I would say that these new forms of proliferations of Skype or Zoom or whatever are just going to continue to emerge, and they don't hinder these social relationships. That's what I would say now. Yeah.
Were there other genres of listening that you encountered during your research? One questioner says, I can think of teacher listening or lawyer listening or other kinds of formal and trained listening that one encounters in daily life. What did you observe about them, and how much do other versions of listening matter?
That's a great question. And yes, absolutely. So now, for instance, I am at UCLA taking classes at the law department. And yesterday we actually had a class on case narrative. And I was just like, as a linguistic anthropologist, I was like, wow, this is amazing. And they basically tell them how to listen and how, I mean, so instead of in Lacan's words, finding that note, you know, in the signifying change that you can resonate with the analyzer, here is like, find that word, you know, that you can actually expand and you can make a case. So yes, definitely. There is a lot of different places. The most important one that I'm also was writing about is in my new research, when I interview a UCIS officer, so an immigration officer, and she told me that in her job, she learned how to listen to lies. And I was just like, and I asked her if she could elaborate, and she told me like, well, yes, I mean, but she said, well, you know, intonation of voice, hesitancies, but then she stopped and said, but not always. Sometimes you just know. So I take that as a form of resonance, right? As a form in which there was an embodied form of listening that actually she claimed was an index of, you know, someone lying, etc. And lastly, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to do in this field. When I presented some of these works at UPenn 2 years ago, and one of the professors asked me like, so what's the genre of listening in the United States? And I was just like, I don't know. I mean, but I mean, I think that what we can do is, I mean, how do women listen? Do women, I mean, there's a lot of research in linguistic practices that point that men and women speak differently, which is true. And it's all through socialization. What about class? What about, so the United States is such a complex country that I think it would be impossible to say, oh, in the United States, people listen X, although maybe we can find it. But I do think that a good start is like how particular communities within the United States or particular, fields listen. And I think we will encounter many different ways, and it will be a very rich. And that's why, again, the concept of genre helps at least in saying like, well, in this community of listeners, we can see these structures.
Here's the last question, and it's I hope you will indulge me, an institutional question. So you were at the Stanford Humanities Center 2 years ago in the most unusual year in our whole 42 years of our history because of the pandemic. We would like to think, we hope that that year was a closed chapter in our history as an institution, and that we will never again be as isolated as we were that year, we hope. Now that it's 2 years in the past, and now the book is out and your second project is well underway, how do you reflect on your time at the center, and what did it, despite the challenges perhaps, what did you gain from it, and what would you tell people about the center, the experience of being here?
Well, I mean, as I said at the beginning, the time there was really amazing, even though we were not face to face, and unfortunately we only met twice, I think, face to face.
That's right.
I have 3 friends for life that I made there, and we talk all the time, and they're probably here present, and we became like this very close community, even though we did everything online. And then the first time we actually got together, it was almost like a blind date. It was like, oh my God, I mean, you exist as a real person. But it was actually, I would say it was magical. And I know that word sounds very kind of cheesy, but it is true. I mean, the place, as you've been, it's beautiful, and it's a great environment to really focus on working. And that's where I finished the book. So I have the stereotypical, second reviewer, came when I was there of the manuscript. And I mean, we always joke because he said that the manuscript was turgid, and that was a word that I didn't know. And we all laugh about it. And then I have the mental space to actually work on it and also advance my second project. But I think that the most rewarding for me, besides the friendships that I made, was listening to others' research. That was incredible. I mean, because I learned from stuff that I will never in my life would, not that I'm not interested, it's just that there are so many things in the world. And those Tuesdays, so it was on Tuesday, I remember on Zoom, we will all get together without food. I still want those avocados that you promised. But anyway, without food, and they will talk about things that I was just like, wow, the concept of time, about economics in Britain, about language, about gender, about all in Japan, stuff. And that was for me the most incredible and fulfilling part of it. And if I could, I would love to continue to attend forever. So you are in for a treat, guys.
Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you. It's so good to see you in virtually again, and we hope we see you back here in person, since maybe especially this year, now that you're down in Southern California, maybe you can come up and visit us sometime this year. Thank you so much for this, Xochitl. It's been we have so many great questions we couldn't get to, but it's been a great occasion for all of us current people at the center now, but also our former fellows. Some of your cohort have come back for this event, and of course our large public audience. Everyone who registered for today's event was automatically entered into a drawing to receive a copy of Xochitl's book, Genres of Listening. And so let me announce the winners. They are a community member, Lynette Arnold, a Stanford student, Rachel Bergman, and a Stanford alumnus, Gabriel Gesmer. Congratulations, and we will be in touch with the 3 of you by email shortly about getting the book to you. And thank you again to all of you out there who have joined us virtually this time. I hope that many of you can return either in person or online, because we have an intellectually lively fall quarter coming along. Next Tuesday, October 4th at 4 p.m. Pacific, will be our first in-person lecture presented with our partners at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. We welcome Richard Jean So of McGill University in our Digital Horizon series, Professor So's topic is How a Pandemic Becomes a Story, Narrative and Social Crisis in the Platform Age. Also coming up, among others, are the sociologist Ruha Benjamin on October 18th and the literary scholar Sadiya Hartman on October 27th, in the latter case for this year's presidential lecture in the humanities. Nearly all of our events are hybrid this year, presented both in person or online, so you should be able to join us regularly wherever you are. Details, of course, always available on the website, shc.stanford.edu. Thank you so much to the audience. Thank you especially to Xochitl, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.